Whether you believe in ghosts or not, as the case may be, few would disagree that a person's grave represents their final and most tangible link with the living, a focal point to allow us to think about who they were and their mark on history, however great or otherwise. This tour of some of the final resting places of Midland Railway staff in Derby's Nottingham Road Cemetery, covering a range of ranks and grades, will give us an insight into spirits of the Midland Railway. Right, let's get started. Oops, sorry, no, don't worry, this is a different George Hudson. The Railway King's buried at Howsham near York. George Pratt was Secretary of the Locomotive Committee, Chief Clerk in the Midland Railway Chief Mechanical Engineer's Office, and Secretary of the Midland Railway Institute. He was also an incorrigible gossip, although from our point of view that was a good thing, as we'll see. With 52.5 years service, he started as a junior clerk under Matthew Kirtley. His grandfather, Thomas Pearson, had been secretary and engineer of the Sheffield and Rotherham Railway prior to its absorption by the Midland Railway. Pratt claimed with some confidence that his grandfather was also the inventor of the railway turntable. He became secretary of the Midland Railway Institute in 1888 and was instrumental in persuading the directors to build the premises across from the station, which survive today. Perhaps his greatest mark on history, however, are his prolific memoirs, first published as a series of articles in the Derby Daily Telegraph and subsequently issued as a 2-volume memoir titled Midland Railway Memories, Personality of Other Days, Lights and Shadows of the Railway Service. In this way he has preserved a treasure trove of Midland Railway tittle-tattle. None better, and here I'm quoting, Mr. J. Swallow, the horse superintendent, lived in Gerrard Street and was a noted pig breeder. He could be seen in the early hours of the morning busy in the streets with his swill tubs, and then at 9 a.m. dressed up, ready to step into a first-class carriage. Away from the railway, Pratt was a trustee of the Rosehill Wesleyan Church. He ended his railway career with retirement in December 1922, finishing along with his company. He died at home at 8 Wilmot Street, Derby, on Saturday the 6th of July 1929, and was laid to rest the following Tuesday with Sir Henry Fowler leading the mourners. Known as Coffee Bowden, Abel Bowden was clearly a prominent character around Derby Station for many years. He had been a driver on the Midland since at least 1866, at which time his regular engine was number 390, working on the east and west branches. Given that he married a young lady from Gloucester in 1859, at which time he gave his occupation as stoker, he was probably very familiar with the West Road. However, much else of what we know of him comes from the prolific writing of the aforementioned George Pratt, who clearly crossed paths with driver Bowden quite regularly. Outside work, they were both prominent Methodists, though perhaps not quite on the same social standing. Bowden was an engine driver, but he was also an entrepreneur on the side. In his wife's name, he had opened a coffee bar close to the station with the aim of providing railwaymen with non-alcoholic sustenance, and this was the source of his nickname. Pratt, meanwhile, was a leading light in the welfare movement, having formed the Embryonic Institute, and Bowden seems to have, at least in part, used Pratt to press the company to legitimise his coffee business. In 1884, a limited company called the Midland Railway Servants' Refreshment Company Limited was registered, with Bowden as one of the directors and Pratt the company secretary. A share issue to finance the venture was, after a faltering start, phenomenally successful, and notably paid 60% dividends. One final snippet we learn from Pratt was that Abel Bowden had bought and paid for his headstone, or likely the footstone in this case, long before he died. He and his wife coincidentally died on the same day, he at home in Derby and she visiting relatives in Bristol. The Venerable Newton Hibbert is remembered chiefly for the bronze plaque procured after his death by his workmates and now preserved in the Midland Railway Study Centre. His story is told in detail on the Study Centre website, but the most remarkable part is his longevity as a Midland Railway employee. He commenced work in the Midland Railway Works as a fitter in 1853 at the age of 13 years, moving across to Litchurch Lane when it opened and continued there still as a fitter until his death in 1921. The dates of both his birth and his commencement with the railway are flexible to say the least. The brass plaque credits him with 71 years of service and 85 years of age. His staff record, still held by the Derbyshire County Record Office, suggests 68 and 81 years respectively. Even so, to quibble over a few years is missing the point. His achievement is no less remarkable. Henry Hitchcock entered the employ of the Midland Railway in 1889 as an engine cleaner, being made fireman in 1890 and driver in October 1899. He met his sudden and sad demise at Peckwash Mill during the early hours of the 1st of December 1900. With his fireman, Frederick Teagle, Hitchcock was driving 060 tender engine number 1433, running chimney first with 44 wagons loaded with coal, limestone and lime from Ambergate, heading home for Chadderton sidings. It was a dark night and rain was falling slightly, resulting in the rails being described as greasy. There was no fog and the signals were clearly visible. In his 14 months as a driver, Hitchcock had become familiar with the road, and on this clear night it's unlikely he would have had any difficulty with his surroundings. Nevertheless, he was unable to bring his train under control at the end of the goods loop, and the catch points did their job. Both men perished as the contents of their tender and the limestone from the first few wagons buried them at the bottom of the embankment. On the Tuesday afternoon following the accident, Henry Hitchcock was laid to rest, preceded by a service at the Railwaymen's Church of St Andrews. The Derby Daily Telegraph reported that he was conveyed from his late residence in Fleet Street amid many manifestations of sorrow and accompanied by a large concourse of sympathising friends. Fred Teagle was buried in his hometown of Sileby. Mr Mitchell is the first of two Derby station masters we will encounter during this tour. He entered the company's service as a dispatch clerk in the parcels office at Derby in April 1861. By 1886 he had advanced to station master's chief clerk under Mr G. H. Rickman, whom we shall meet later. More promotions took him variously to Kentish Town, Liverpool and Manchester, until 1897 when he returned to Derby, succeeding James Maxey as the station master. He served in this role until October 1901, when he was further promoted to district superintendent at Derby, being followed as station master by George Cook. He retired in 1908 after 47 years' service, but died barely a year later. John Blackwell is among the earliest of the employees that we will be looking at. We know from the 1841 census that he was a porter at Bayton on the North Midland Railway, and as such it is probable that he was with the company since the opening of the line. By 1851 he was a pointsman at Derby, and his single brush with history came on the night of Thursday the 18th of June 1868, when Mr Etcheser's cheese warehouse in the original North Midland Railway goods shed at Derby Station spectacularly burnt down. Quoting the Derby Mercury, it is stated that about 20 minutes to 9 o'clock on Thursday evening, a pointsman named Blackwell was on duty against his box at the north end of the platform and facing the cheese warehouse, when all at once he heard an explosion, and on looking up saw dense volumes of flame issuing through the windows of the top story and also penetrating the roof. He at once blew his whistle and then ran along the platform and gave the alarm of fire. With the coming of the block telegraph, Blackwell became a signalman at Derby Junction box and died in service on the 4th of August 1876. Langdon was appointed the telegraph superintendent of the Midland Railway in 1878, having previously worked for the embryonic post office and the London and South Western Railway. He was the author of a well-known work entitled The Application of Electricity to Railway Working, first published in 1877. Under his supervision, the entire block system of the Midland Railway was completely reorganised, during which, we're told, the telegraph wires increased from 8,000 to 30,000 miles, while the number of telegraph instruments increased from 7,000 to 26,000. He'll be best remembered for his pioneering work on interlocking block. His experimental system installed between Spondon and Sawley in 1883 developed into the Midland's famous rotary interlocking block instruments. By the time he retired in 1902, there were over 1,000 telegraph stations and 1,070 block signalling posts on the Midlands system. After he retired, he was retained as a consulting electrical engineer. He died on the 12th of August 1905 at Westcliff-on-Sea near Southend, but was returned to Derby to be buried with his late wife. George Rickman's grave is almost lost to the encroaching grass, which is a sad irony given the send-off that he received. Mr. Rickman is said to have been Derby's first station master, and it is documented that he began his railway service in 1838. However, I haven't been unable to find any record or mention of the station master, or presumably station masters, of the so-called Trijunct station before the three constituent companies amalgamated. In any event, Rickman remained in post until his death on the 1st of November 1866, 20 years on from the opening of the station. His death was reported that many changes have been made this month in the arrival and departure of trains, and Mr. Rickman, anxious to instruct the company's servants in their new duties, went down to the South Junction to superintend the departure of some trains, and was walking from thence towards the North Junction on the line when the Nottingham train due at Derby at 3:10 p.m. came up behind him. However, even contemporary reports given at the inquest are somewhat confusing. One says that Rickman was, quote, out to arrange a passenger train which was going out to King's Cross, while another witness stated that Rickman was there to, quote, see the Buxton carriage was properly uncoupled. Neither account explains why the Nottingham train was routed onto the North Curve, where Rickman stood, seemingly secure in his belief that he was not in the train's path. Rickman's death was recalled by George Pratt in his memoirs. He said, the death of Mr. Rickman caused a great sensation. His funeral was most imposing. I remember it very well. The Derby Mercury reported that the funeral took place in the presence of an immense number of people, and we are informed that so large a concourse has not been seen within the boundary walls since the formation of the new burial ground. They went on. Mr. Kirtley attended in his private carriage and was present at the grave. About 300 of the Midland Railway employees followed, and it is computed that nearly 15,000 persons attended the funeral. Most students of Midland Railway history will be well aware that the company excelled at standardisation. Signal boxes and station buildings are prime examples of a design repeated over and over with only modest changes. So too, it seems, with monuments. Nottingham Road Cemetery hosts at least 3 near identical examples. The explanation is given in the Derby Mercury of Wednesday the 7th of July 1869, which reports, 2 large and elaborately carved monuments have been erected in the new cemetery, to the memory of the late G.N. Brown and Thomas Walklake, gentlemen who had been for a long period in the service of the Midland Railway Company. They are both of the same design, with some slight alteration in the carving introduced, and are in the form of a Gothic cross, with massive base and columns with carved capitals on each side, the total height being about 12 feet. They are executed in Yorkshire stone of the most durable character, and are by the sculptor Mr. J.B. Robinson, to whose care and skill the work was confided. George Brown was company secretary, successor to Joseph Sanders, who died suddenly in 1856, and served until he too died in service 12 years later. Thomas Walklake's death occurred the previous week, and that gentleman was the company's goods manager. The third memorial of this trio, that of John Moore, was erected over 10 years later. Moore was a true company man and had served as its assistant secretary since amalgamation, having started with the Midland Counties Railway at its inception when Moore had been assistant to John Fox Bell. Of his passing, the Derby Mercury wrote, "For a period of 35 years from that time to the day but one before his death, he discharged the duties entrusted to him with methodical regularity, conscientious zeal, and conspicuous ability. His energy and devotion to business know no compromise, while the natural goodness of his heart, his perfect truthfulness, and generous kindness of disposition never failed to secure for him the esteem of all and the affection of those with whom he was most closely associated in official relations. A man of quiet and retiring habits, almost to shyness, abhorring all pretension or self-assertion, he entered little into what is called society, but the few sincere friends who had known him for many years will recall to themselves how modest he was of his own abilities, how forbearing to the infirmities of others, how kind and gentle his manner, how willing and ready he was to render assistance in difficulty. Every one of them will feel that he has lost a true friend, whose memory will ever be cherished with affectionate esteem." The eldest son of the noted Staffordshire County Surveyor of the same name, Charles Trubshaw, was the chief architect of the Midland Railway over a period of 30 years. He was credited as the designer of over 100 stations, including major undertakings at Bradford, Leicester and Sheffield. Trubshaw also designed the Midland hotels at Manchester and Bradford, of which a contemporary report stated, "They are undoubtedly the most up-to-date in every detail." He was a Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects and, along with his predecessor John Holloway Sanders, was amongst the first of his profession in Derby to hold this distinction. He died on the 15th of February 1917, aged 76, at home at 123 Osmaston Road, Derby. The funeral was said to have been a quiet affair, with his successor, Alfred Wheatley, chief among the few Midland Railway officials present. Of all the personalities we've encountered in this cemetery, Sir Henry Fowler, least of all, needs an introduction. However, here is the potted history of his career, which began on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway. He moved to the Midland to take up the post of gas engineer in 1900. Within 10 years with the Midland, he had progressed through locomotive works manager to the newly created post of chief mechanical engineer. During the First World War, he took on the post of superintendent of the Royal Aircraft Factories, for which he received a knighthood and the rank of lieutenant colonel. On grouping, he served first as the deputy CME of the LMS, before taking on the CME role itself from 1925 until his retirement in 1933. I think that no better measure of the man and his accomplishments can be drawn than from his formal manner of address. I am quite sure that all the people at rest in this cemetery had interesting and eventful lives in their own way. Few, however, left much of a mark on history. Job Kirk, on the other hand, managed to do so twice, though the first is something of a mystery. His gravestone proudly records 11th of October 1851, Her Majesty's Driver. A native of Leicester, the 1841 census records his residence as Siddles Lane, Derby, and occupation as engineer at age 20, leading to the inference that he was one of the original drivers for the Midland Counties Railway. The newspaper archives confirm that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were on a visit to Manchester on Friday the 10th of October 1851, having arrived there the night before by the London and North Western Railway Royal Train from Balmoral via visits at Preston and Liverpool. Their Majesties were conveyed from Patricroft Station by royal barge along the Bridgewater Canal for their overnight stay at Worsley Hall, seat of Lord Earlsmere. However, there's no mention of an engagement on the 11th of October, though the possibility of a private visit can't be ruled out. In 1851 there was clearly no direct route over which the royal party would pass over Midland metals, and therein lies the enigma of Job's claim to have driven the royal train. Less than a year later, his life as a senior and evidently favoured driver was turned upside down. Approaching Draycott station with the evening mail train from Rugby to Derby on the 6th of August 1852, his locomotive shed a tyre. A common enough occurrence at this time. Unhappily on this occasion a large fragment of iron flew up and penetrated the boiler. Job and his fireman either jumped or fell from the footplate as they battled the escaping steam, and the former partially fell under his train and lost both his legs. Given the severity of the injury and the relatively remoteness from even primitive medical treatment, he was lucky to escape with his life. We return to Kirk family legend now, in that the story is handed down that Queen Victoria herself was so moved by his experience that she was responsible for procuring his 2 balsa false legs. The company looked after him too, and once he was mobile again he was appointed gatekeeper at the Brunswick Gates, conveniently close to his residence at Nelson Street. He died at 91 Lower Madeley Street, Derby, on the 5th of December 1888, aged 69. That concludes our tour. Rather than end with yet more views of graves, I thought I'd share with you what little we have in the way of moving images of the Midland Railway and its staff at work, filmed in and around Millhouse's shed. I also want to read the poem we have seen twice on this tour, on Abel Bowden's Footstone, and the pamphlet produced to raise funds for the families of Henry Hitchcock and Fred Teagle, who died at Peckwash Mill. My engine now is cold and still, no water does my boiler fill. My coal affords its flame no more, my days of usefulness are o'er. My wheels deny their noted speed, no more my guiding hand they heed. My whistle too has lost its tone, its shrill and thrilling sounds are gone. My valves are now thrown open wide, my flangers all refuse to glide. My clacks also, though once so strong, refuse to aid the busy throng. No more I feel each urging breath, my steam is now condensed in death. Life's railway's o'er, each station past, in death I'm stopped and rest at last. Farewell, dear friends, and cease to weep. In Christ I'm safe, in Him I sleep.